My father threw me and my twin boys out into the freezing November night, right after I spent $33,000 to save his house from being auctioned off. He stood in the doorway of our ancestral home in Atlanta, a house my grandmother built from nothing, and told me there was no room at the table for us. My mother peered over his shoulder, a cold sneer on her face, and told me my younger sister deserved the space more than I did. Then she slammed the heavy oak door right in my face. I stood there on the porch holding a 20-pound roasted turkey while my 10-year-old sons shivered in the cold. I did not cry. I did not scream. Instead, I walked back to my car, pulled out my phone, and set into motion a plan that would legally strip them of everything they thought they owned. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family who completely underestimated your worth. My name is Vanessa. I am 34 years old, a senior financial auditor, and a single mother to two incredible boys, Jordan and Malik. To understand how we ended up standing on that freezing porch, you have to understand the drive over there. The evening started with such innocent excitement. The heater in my SUV was blasting warm air as we navigated the busy Atlanta streets. The rich smell of baked macaroni and cheese, slow-cooked collard greens, and the massive roasted turkey filled the tight space of the car. I had spent the entire previous night and most of the morning cooking everything from scratch. I wanted everything to be absolutely perfect. Jordan and Malik were in the back seat wearing their matching holiday sweaters, arguing playfully about who would get the larger turkey leg. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, my knuckles slightly white, trying to steady my own breathing. I was exhausted, but I was determined to have a peaceful holiday. My family dynamic had always been deeply flawed. For as long as I can remember, my younger sister Jasmine was the golden child. She is 32 now, but she still acts like a spoiled teenager. While I spent my 20s working my way through college and building a career in corporate finance. Jasmine was floating from one failed venture to another, always bailed out by our parents. My father Elias and my mother Brenda always made excuses for her. They would say Jasmine was delicate and needed extra support because the world was too harsh for her sensitive soul. Meanwhile, they expected me to be the strong one. They expected me to be the independent black woman who could take a hit and keep on moving without a single word of complaint. They relied heavily on my financial stability while simultaneously resenting me for it. This resentment reached a boiling point when Jasmine married Trevor. Trevor is a white tech entrepreneur whose companies only seem to exist on paper. He is exactly the kind of man who uses complicated industry jargon to hide his massive insecurities and utter lack of actual income. He always looked down on me, a black woman, succeeding in a corporate space where he was failing miserably. My parents blindly worshipped him simply because he drove a leased luxury car and promised them the world. They treated him like the son they never had completely, ignoring the fact that I was the one actually keeping the family afloat. The streetlights of the rapidly gentrifying neighborhood illuminated the interior of my car as we approached the old Victorian house. This house was a massive symbol of generational wealth in our family. My grandmother worked her hands to the bone cleaning houses and taking in laundry just to pay it off. She left it behind as a permanent sanctuary for our family. But just 1 month ago, I discovered a horrifying truth. My parents had completely neglected to pay the property taxes for years. The county was preparing to seize the house. They were literally days away from being put out on the street with absolutely nothing. They called me crying uncontrollably, begging for a miracle. As an auditor, I know exactly how the tax system works. I stepped in and used my hard-earned savings to pay $33,000 to clear the debt and keep the doors open. They cried, hugged me, and promised this Thanksgiving would be a special celebration of family. I believed them. I genuinely believed that saving our generational home had finally earned me the love and respect I had craved my entire life. I pulled the car into the long driveway. The house was blazing with warm lights. I could see the silhouettes of people moving inside, laughing, and having a wonderful time. I immediately noticed the oversized truck belonging to Trevor parked right on the front lawn, his heavy tires tearing up the grass. My grandmother used to tend so carefully. I felt a tight knot of anxiety form in my stomach, but I pushed it down for the sake of my children. I turned off the engine and looked back at my boys. They were smiling brightly, eager to see their grandparents and play in the big house. I unbuckled my seatbelt, took a very deep breath, and grabbed the massive aluminum tray holding the turkey. We walked up the wooden steps of the porch together. The evening air was biting cold, but I felt a warm rush of hopeful anticipation. I reached out and firmly rang the doorbell, completely unaware that the next 5 minutes would permanently destroy my family as the heavy door creaked open, revealing my father standing there with a cold, unforgiving stare. He offered no greeting. He simply crossed his arms and blocked the entrance completely. "Dad, it is freezing out here, let us in," I said, my voice tight as the wind whipped across the porch. I shifted the heavy aluminum pan in my hands, trying to balance the 20-pound bird. Behind him, the house was alive with the sounds of a classic holiday playlist and the clinking of glasses. The warmth radiating from the hallway smelled of cinnamon and baked apples, a stark contrast to the bitter November chill. Elias did not budge. His 6'2" frame filled the doorway entirely, forming a solid wall between my children and their family. He looked down at me with a hardened expression, his jaw set tight. "I am sorry, Vanessa," he said, though his tone held absolutely no apology. "There is no room for you tonight." I blinked, staring at him in pure disbelief. I thought he was playing some sort of cruel joke. I forced a small chuckle, thinking he would step aside, but his eyes remained dead and serious. "What do you mean there is no room?" I asked, keeping my voice low so the boys would not panic. "We have always fit in this house. It has 4 bedrooms and a massive dining room." Elias crossed his arms over his chest, his posture rigid. "Trevor invited his parents and his sister from the suburbs," he explained casually, as if this was a perfectly normal thing to tell your own daughter. "They drove a very long way to be here, and they are our guests of honor tonight. We only have so many chairs at the main table, and Jasmine wants her in-laws to feel comfortable. Having you and the boys squeezed in the corner or sitting in the kitchen will just make things look cluttered and awkward." My jaw clenched so hard my teeth ached. I looked down at Jordan and Malik, who were shivering in their matching sweaters. Jordan tugged at my coat, looking up at his grandfather with wide, confused eyes. "Grandpa, are we not having dinner with you?" he asked, his small voice trembling from the cold. Elias did not even make eye contact with his own grandson. He kept his gaze fixed on the space just above my head. "It is just not a good night for this, Vanessa," he muttered, shifting his weight. "You should have called before you just showed up expecting us to accommodate you. You know how stressed your sister gets when things are not perfect." I could feel a hot wave of pure rage rising in my chest, threatening to spill over. I had spent the entire day cooking the centerpiece of their meal, and he was treating me like an uninvited solicitor. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to remain composed. I did not want to give him the satisfaction of seeing me lose control. "Dad," I whispered fiercely, stepping closer so only he could hear. "Are you out of your mind? I just paid $33,000 to the county last month. I wiped out my entire emergency savings so you and Mom would not be sleeping in a shelter tonight. I saved this house, and you are telling me I cannot step foot inside because Trevor needs extra legroom for his fake wealthy family." Elias flushed his face, turning a dark shade of red. "Do not you dare throw that money in my face," he hissed, his voice dripping with venom. "You have a good job. You sit in a fancy office all day while your sister struggles to find her path. You owed it to this family to help out. It was not a ticket to come here and act like you own the place." Before I could even process the sheer audacity of his words, my mother Brenda appeared in the hallway. She was wearing a brand new silk blouse and expensive-looking jewelry that I knew for a fact they could not afford a month ago. She pushed past Elias, her face twisted into a familiar sneer that she reserved only for me. "What is the holdup, Elias?" she snapped, before turning her cold eyes on me. "Oh, it is you. I thought we told you we were keeping it intimate this year." "Intimate," I repeated, my voice shaking with a mixture of hurt and anger. "Mom, I bought the turkey. I paid the taxes. I kept this roof over your head. Brenda rolled her eyes, letting out a loud, dramatic sigh. Always making it about you, Vanessa, she sneered, adjusting her new pearl necklace. You always have to be the center of attention. You think just because you have a little bit of money, you can dictate how we run our family. Jasmine has had a terrible year. She suffered a miscarriage last year, and she is still grieving. She needs this night to be perfect. She needs to feel surrounded by love and support, not your constant judgment and negativity. She deserves it more than you do. You are strong. You always manage on your own. Now be a good sister for once in your life and go home. I stood there completely paralyzed by the cruelty of her words. The woman who gave birth to me was looking at me like I was a pest, an infection that needed to be scrubbed from her pristine life. She reached out and grabbed the edge of the heavy aluminum pan in my hands. I will take that, she said casually, trying to yank the turkey from my grip. Jasmine promised Trevor we would have a home-cooked bird. You can go grab some fast food on your way back to your apartment. The sheer disrespect was so profound it almost took my breath away. She wanted to banish me and my children into the freezing night, but she still wanted to feast on the meal I spent hours preparing. A sudden cold clarity washed over me. The desperate child inside me who had spent 34 years begging for their scraps of affection simply died in that moment. I pulled the pan back sharply, nearly knocking her off balance. No, I said, my voice dropping to a dead flat calm. If we are not welcome at the table, then my food does not grace it. Brenda gasped, clutching her chest as if I had just slapped her. You selfish brat! She spat, her face contorting with rage. You are ruining your sister's holiday. This is exactly why nobody wants you around. You have no heart. Get off my porch before I call the police. She reached out, grabbed the heavy brass handle of the front door and slammed it shut with a deafening crack. The sound echoed through the cold night air, ringing in my ears like a gunshot. The deadbolt clicked into place, locking me out of the house my money had just saved. I stood there in the freezing darkness, the heavy tray burning my hands through the oven mitts. The warm glow of the windows seemed to mock me. I could hear the muffled sound of laughter erupting from the dining room, completely unaffected by the fact that they had just discarded my children and me like trash. Jordan started to cry softly, burying his face in my coat. Malik grabbed my hand, his small fingers ice cold. It is okay, babies, I whispered, turning away from the closed door. We are going to have our own dinner tonight. I marched back to the car, my mind working with absolute surgical precision. They thought they had won. They thought they had successfully used me and tossed me aside. But they did not realize the fatal mistake they had just made. I buckled Jordan and Malik into their booster seats, making sure they were completely secure. I took the massive aluminum tray holding the turkey and carefully placed it in the trunk of my vehicle next to the spare tire. The heavy thud of the trunk closing sounded like a final period at the end of a very long and painful chapter of my life. I climbed into the driver's seat and pressed the ignition button. The engine roared to life and the heater immediately began blasting warm air, but the deep chill settling into my bones had absolutely nothing to do with the bitter November weather outside. I looked up into the rearview mirror. My two boys were huddled together, looking incredibly small and utterly confused. Their little faces were illuminated by the harsh orange glow of the streetlights. "Mommy, why is Grandpa mad at us?" Malik asked, his voice barely a whisper above the sound of the fan. Jordan wiped his eyes with the sleeve of his matching holiday sweater, the exact one I had bought specifically for this family dinner. "Did we do something wrong, Mommy? Are we bad boys?" My heart completely shattered into a million tiny jagged pieces. I reached my hand back between the seats and gently squeezed their little knees. "No, my sweet babies," I said, keeping my voice perfectly steady and completely devoid of the dark rage boiling underneath my skin. "You are the best boys in the entire world. Grandpa is just confused right now, and sometimes adults make very silly, very hurtful choices. But we do not need their table to have a wonderful Thanksgiving dinner. We have each other, and right now that is the only family we need." I put the car in drive and pulled away from the curb. I refused to look back at the brightly lit windows of the ancestral home. I refused to look at the heavy oak door that my own mother had just slammed in my face. I focused entirely on the dark road ahead. We drove in heavy silence for several miles, navigating the mostly empty streets of Atlanta. The city was practically shut down for the holiday. Warm yellow light spilled from the windows of other houses where normal families were actually gathering in love and gratitude. The stark contrast between their warmth and my cold, isolating reality was a very bitter pill to swallow. After about 20 minutes of driving, I finally spotted the glowing neon sign of a fast food burger joint that was miraculously still open. I pulled the heavy vehicle into the drive-through line. The crackling voice over the speaker cheerfully asked for my order. I ordered 3 double cheeseburgers, 3 large French fries, and 3 giant chocolate milkshakes. It was a far cry from the homemade baked macaroni and cheese, the slow-cooked collard greens, and the perfectly seasoned 20-pound turkey I had spent the last 24 hours meticulously preparing. But as I pulled up to the window and handed the tired teenage cashier my credit card, I realized something profound. This greasy paper bag of fast food held more honest, genuine love than that entire Victorian house combined. I parked the vehicle in a dimly lit corner of the empty asphalt parking lot. I turned around in my seat and handed the boys their warm, foil-wrapped burgers. We made a fun little game out of it. I told them we were having a top-secret midnight picnic inside our spaceship. Slowly but surely their tears began to dry up. The deep confusion and hurt in their innocent eyes was gradually replaced by the simple joy of dipping salty French fries into thick chocolate milkshakes. They laughed at my terrible jokes, and for a brief, precious moment, the crushing weight pressing down on my chest lifted. I watched them eat, feeling a fierce, primal protective instinct surge through my veins. I promised myself right then and there that I would never let anyone make them feel unwanted ever again. Not my father, not my mother, and certainly not my sister and her pathetic excuse for a husband. I took a slow bite of my own burger, forcing myself to chew and swallow, even though my stomach was tied in tight, painful knots. That is exactly when my phone buzzed loudly in the center console cup holder. The bright screen illuminated the dark cabin of the car. I glanced down and saw a text message notification popping up. It was from Trevor. I picked up the phone, my thumb hovering cautiously over the glass screen. I knew whatever he had to say was going to be completely laced with poison and arrogance, but I also knew I needed to read it. I needed to see exactly how bold and delusional they had become. I swiped to open the text thread. The message was incredibly long and accompanied by a high-resolution picture. The photograph showed the beautifully set dining room table in the house of my grandmother. Jasmine was sitting right at the head of the table, smiling brightly, while the parents of Trevor raised their expensive crystal wine glasses in a festive toast. My own parents were standing in the background, looking absolutely thrilled and proud. But it was the block of text below the picture that truly revealed the staggering depth of their delusion. "Hey, Vanessa," Trevor wrote. "Thanks for the free turkey delivery, but we decided to toss it straight in the trash where it belongs. My mom brought a beautiful organic honey-glazed ham, and we just did not have room in the fridge for your sad little offering. Jasmine told me you threw a massive tantrum on the front porch. Honestly, it is super embarrassing that a woman your age cannot handle being left out of an intimate gathering. You always try to buy your way into the good graces of other people with your little corporate auditor salary. But money cannot buy class. Speaking of money, do not ever come back to this house expecting a refund or a thank you for paying those back taxes." Elias and Brenda realized you were just trying to hold that payment over their heads to control them like you always do. So they did the smart thing. They officially signed the deed over to Jasmine and me this morning. We are the absolute legal owners now. The house is completely protected from your greed. Consider the $33,000 a late rent payment for all the years you lived there for free as a kid. Have a nice life eating fast food in your car alone. I read the long message twice, just to make absolutely sure I was not hallucinating. I stared at the glowing screen, the incredibly cruel words burning themselves deeply into my memory. He was bragging. He was actually bragging about throwing my food away, stealing my hard-earned money, and taking the house. A slow, cold, calculated smile crept across my face. I did not feel angry anymore. I felt an incredible, overwhelming sense of clarity. Trevor was a man who genuinely thought he was the smartest person in any given room. He used complicated startup jargon and wore tailored suits he definitely could not afford just to mask his own failures. He thought because I was a quiet black woman who worked silently in an office crunching numbers that I was somehow beneath his intellect. He truly believed that my parents, when they signed a simple piece of paper, gave him the keys to the kingdom. He thought he had completely outsmarted me. What Trevor did not know, and what my parents were far too ignorant to understand, was how the property tax laws actually operated in our county. When a property is about to be seized for delinquent taxes, you do not just pay the bill and make it magically disappear. If you know exactly what you are doing, you buy the tax lien. And that is exactly what I had done. I did not just pay their taxes for them. I bought the debt from the county government under the name of my private limited liability company. Trevor thought he held the winning hand because he had a worthless piece of paper signed by two elderly people who had absolutely no idea what they were doing. He thought he could insult my career, throw my crying children out into the freezing cold, and walk away a richer man. I locked my phone screen and set it gently back in the cup holder. I looked at my boys who were now happily finishing the last of their milkshakes. "Mommy, is everything okay?" Jordan asked, wiping a smudge of chocolate from his chin. I reached back and handed him a clean napkin. "Everything is perfectly fine, my sweet boy," I said, my smile genuine and bright for the first time all night. "In fact, everything is going exactly according to plan." I started the car and pulled out of the parking lot, heading toward our warm, safe apartment. The trap was officially set, and the fools had just walked right into it with a massive smile on their faces. We walked into our two-bedroom apartment on the 4th floor of a quiet complex. It was not a sprawling Victorian mansion with wrap-around porches and original stained glass windows, but it was warm, and it was safe, and it was entirely mine, paid for by my own hard work and careful planning. I helped Jordan and Malik change out of their matching holiday sweaters and into their favorite superhero pajamas. I tucked them into their twin beds, pulling the heavy blankets up to their chins. They fell asleep almost immediately, exhausted from the emotional whiplash of the evening and the heavy fast food. I stood in their doorway for a long time, simply watching their little chests rise and fall in rhythm. My fierce protective instinct flared up again, but this time it was tempered with a very cold and calculating strategy. I gently closed their bedroom door and walked into my kitchen. I poured myself a large glass of cheap red wine and sat down at the granite island. I placed my phone face up on the counter and waited. Almost immediately, the screen lit up with a barrage of notifications. It was the massive family group chat that my mother had created several years ago. She cleverly named it the Atlanta Family Blessings Thread. There were over 30 relatives in this chat, ranging from my parents down to second cousins and distant aunts. I tapped the screen and opened the thread. Jasmine had just uploaded a massive album of high-resolution photos from the dinner. There were pictures of the expensive organic ham sitting on my grandmother's vintage serving platter. There were pictures of the fancy table settings and multiple selfies of her and Trevor kissing romantically in the grand foyer. The caption below the photos was a long, rambling paragraph filled with fake gratitude and subtle venom. She wrote about how incredibly blessed she was to officially own the family home. She thanked our parents for trusting her and Trevor to carry on the family legacy and build a beautiful permanent nest for their future children. She even threw in a pointed line about how a house is only a true home when it is filled with people who value love and connection over cold, hard cash and corporate ambition. The replies from the extended family poured in like a toxic landslide. My Aunt Diane was the first to comment. Diane was a woman who had borrowed thousands of dollars from me over the years and magically forgot to ever pay a single cent back. She wrote that she was so proud of Jasmine for finally settling down and that the beloved house was absolutely in the right hands. My cousin Marcus quickly added a comment saying it was about time my parents gave the property to the child who actually visits them out of love, and not just out of a need to control everything. Marcus was currently unemployed and living in his mother's basement, so his opinion on property ownership was laughable at best. My mother Brenda could not resist adding her own fuel to the digital fire. She sent a long emotional message praising Trevor for being such a strong traditional provider. She wrote that it was such a massive relief to pass the heavy burden of homeownership onto a highly capable man instead of dealing with certain arrogant people who think a steady paycheck makes them the absolute boss of the entire family. I took a slow sip of my red wine, reading every single word with a detached sense of amusement. They were all willingly participating in a massive collective delusion. They truly believed that my career and my financial independence were terrible character flaws. They honestly thought that paying the bills and keeping them all out of extreme poverty was just a manipulative power play on my part. Jasmine and Trevor were being heralded as the brilliant saviors of the family legacy, while they were actively destroying it from the inside out. I scrolled back up to the picture of the signed deed Trevor had texted me earlier in the car. As an auditor, I knew exactly what a standard quitclaim deed looked like. And more importantly, I knew exactly how completely useless a quitclaim deed was when the property in question was heavily encumbered by a massive local tax lien. I knew I could just stay completely silent and let the legal trap snap shut on its own in a few short weeks. But I wanted to watch them squirm a little bit tonight. I wanted to plant a tiny seed of deep financial doubt in their arrogant minds. I wanted them to know that I was not sitting in my apartment crying over their cruel rejection. I tapped the reply box at the bottom of the screen and began to type. My fingers moved steadily and calmly across the digital keyboard. I did not use any angry words or defensive explanations. I did not justify my absence or mention the turkey they threw away. I simply wrote a very polite and completely detached professional message. I hit send and watched my words appear at the very bottom of the active chat thread. Congratulations, Jasmine and Trevor, I wrote. The house looks incredibly beautiful tonight. Since you are the official legal owners now, please make sure you contact the Fulton County Assessor Office first thing on Monday morning. You need to officially update the mailing address for the property tax bills and the public registry immediately. I would hate for you to miss the upcoming annual assessments or any outstanding collection notices, since those financial burdens are now your sole legal responsibility. Have a wonderful Thanksgiving evening with the family. I set the phone down heavily on the granite counter and took another long sip of my wine. I watched the glowing screen intently. The rapid-fire barrage of incoming notifications completely stopped. The lively and toxic group chat went completely dead silent. I could almost perfectly picture the scene unfolding in the elegant dining room of the Victorian house. I could vividly imagine the smug color draining slightly from the face of Trevor as he read my polite message. He was a fake entrepreneur, drowning in massive secret debt, and the very mention of county assessors and tax collections was bound to trigger his deep financial anxiety. My parents probably brushed the message off as me simply being petty and bitter. But Trevor would definitely know enough about real estate to feel a very sharp twinge of panic in his chest. 2 full minutes passed, in absolute silence. Then 5 minutes passed. Finally, a single typing indicator appeared at the very bottom of the screen. It was Jasmine. She replied with a short, dismissive message, telling me to stop being so incredibly bitter and ruining their joyful announcement with my boring accounting talk. She told me Trevor had everything completely under control and that his new tech startup funds would easily cover any minor bills the old house might have. I smiled a genuine warm smile to myself in the empty kitchen. Startup funds, minor bills. She had absolutely no idea that her genius husband was entirely broke. She had no idea that the minor bill she was casually referring to was a $33,000 county lien currently owned and controlled by my private limited liability company. I closed the messaging application and opened my work laptop. I needed to prepare for the inevitable and messy fallout. My message was definitely going to force Trevor to look into the county tax situation. And when he finally checked the public records, he was going to make a very desperate and stupid move. I needed to be entirely ready for him. I was staring at the blank spreadsheet on my screen when my phone suddenly vibrated against the granite countertop. The caller identification displayed the name Trevor in bold letters. It had not even been 10 minutes since I dropped my comment in the family group chat. He took the bait faster than I actually anticipated. I let the phone vibrate 3 times before I finally swiped the screen to accept the call. I pressed the phone to my ear, but I did not say a single word. I wanted to hear exactly how he would open this conversation. I wanted to measure the exact level of panic hiding behind his usual wall of suffocating arrogance. Listen to me very carefully, Vanessa. He snapped, his voice completely lacking the fake friendly tone he used around my parents. You think you are so incredibly clever, dropping little hints about property taxes in the family chat? You think because you wear a cheap pantsuit and crunch numbers in a cubicle all day, that you understand how real wealth actually works? He let out a condescending little laugh that grated on my nerves. Let me break this down for you in terms your little auditor brain can process. Real estate is about leverage and strategic asset management. It is not about hoarding pennies to pay government fees. Your parents finally realized that they needed a real man with actual business acumen to manage their portfolio. They were tired of you constantly trying to hold a basic tax payment over their heads just to stroke your own massive ego. You have always been so incredibly toxic and greedy. I kept the phone pressed to my ear, remaining absolutely silent. He took my silence as a sign of submission and plowed forward with his unhinged lecture. He told me I was just a bitter single mother who was jealous of the beautiful life he was building with Jasmine. He said my parents were actually terrified of my aggressive nature and that he stepped in to protect their generational wealth from my grasping hands. The sheer audacity of his words was staggering. Here was a failing white tech bro who had never built anything of value in his entire life, lecturing a successful black female auditor about wealth. He was standing inside the house my black grandmother scrubbed floors for decades to buy, and he was telling me I was the one trying to steal it. He threw around meaningless startup buzzwords talking about disrupting the local housing market and maximizing the asset equity of the old house. I sat there in my quiet kitchen, listening to a man who had not drawn a legitimate salary in 5 years try to verbally tear me down. He told me that my $33,000 was nothing but a pathetic attempt to buy the love of a family that simply did not want me around. He said I needed to seek professional therapy for my deep-rooted control issues. He assured me the quitclaim deed they signed was completely ironclad and legally binding, and that any attempt I made to challenge it would result in him destroying me in court with his highly paid lawyers. Lawyers I knew for an absolute fact he could never afford. You are just a glorified calculator, Vanessa, he sneered, his voice dripping with venom. You have absolutely no vision. You look at a property and you just see liabilities and tax codes. I look at that house and I see a massive foundation for my next major venture. My investors are already lining up to back my new company based on the equity I just secured tonight. Do not try to sabotage my success just because your own life is empty and sad. You are cut out of this family because you refuse to play as a team. We are moving forward without your negativity. I did not interrupt him. I let him monologue for almost 5 solid minutes. I listened to his breathing become slightly ragged as he worked himself into a self-righteous frenzy. The louder he spoke, the more obvious his underlying terror became. He was trying to bully me into submission because my text message had struck a massive nerve. He needed me to back down and apologize so he could go back to the dinner table, feeling like the undisputed king of the castle. He was desperately trying to convince himself that he held all the power. He finally paused to take a breath, waiting for me to start screaming or crying or defending myself. "Are you even listening to me?" he demanded, his voice cracking just a fraction of an inch. I pulled the phone away from my ear and tapped the red end call button. I did not give him a single syllable of response. Let him sit in the agonizing silence and wonder what I was planning. Let him obsess over why I was not fighting back. I tossed the phone onto the kitchen island and turned my full attention back to the glowing screen of my work laptop. The law does not care about gaslighting, and numbers do not care about startup buzzwords. I opened my web browser and navigated directly to the official Fulton County Tax Commissioner portal. I typed in my secure credentials and logged into my private limited liability company account. I pulled up the master file for the property located in my grandmother's name. I stared at the bold green letters confirming that the tax lien was active and fully legally assigned to my company. I scrolled down the page examining the cold, hard data. The names of my parents, Elias and Brenda, were still listed as the highly delinquent owners. The quitclaim deed Trevor was bragging about had absolutely zero power to erase this massive recorded government debt. I smiled, looking at the exact expiration date of the redemption period. They had exactly 1 week left to pay me back every single penny of the $33,000 plus a massive state-mandated penalty fee. If they failed to pay the debt in full, the law would allow me to permanently foreclose on the property and strip them of their ownership rights forever. Trevor thought he was securing equity to impress fake investors, but all he was actually doing was cementing his own financial grave. I gently closed the laptop, feeling a profound sense of peace wash over me. The trap was locked and the countdown had officially begun. I sat in the dim light of my kitchen for a few moments, letting the absolute silence of the apartment settle around me. But my analytical mind was far from finished. I needed to know exactly how deep this betrayal ran. I opened the laptop back up, navigating away from the tax commissioner portal and going straight into the official deed registry for the county. I typed in the exact address of the Victorian house. The search results populated almost instantly. There it was, right at the top of the public record, a quitclaim deed filed just 2 days before Thanksgiving. I clicked on the digital document and the scanned image filled my screen. It was honestly painful to look at. My parents, Elias and Brenda, had legally transferred all their rights, title, and interest in the property to Jasmine and Trevor. Under the section for consideration, the amount paid was listed as $10 and unconditional love. They had literally given away the only valuable asset our family possessed for the price of a cheap fast food meal. They did not hire a lawyer. They did not perform a standard title search. If they had paid even a fraction of attention, they would have seen the massive tax lien sitting right on top of the property records. But Trevor was in a massive rush, and my parents were completely blinded by their absolute worship of him. But why the sudden rush? I asked myself, staring at the clumsy signatures of my parents on the digital screen. Trevor always liked to play the incredibly wealthy tech entrepreneur, but he never actually wanted to own real estate in a predominantly black working-class neighborhood. He always talked about moving Jasmine to a massive gated community in the affluent northern suburbs. So why did he suddenly manipulate my parents into giving him a house he fundamentally despised? The answer had to be hidden somewhere in his own financial records. I am a senior corporate auditor. Finding hidden money and exposing financial lies is not just my job, it is my absolute superpower. I opened a new tab on my browser and began a deep surgical dive into the public financial background of my dear brother-in-law. I started with basic civil court records and uniform commercial code filings. It did not take very long for the shiny, pristine facade of his tech startup lifestyle to completely crumble before my eyes. Trevor was not a visionary entrepreneur. He was a degenerate gambler, hiding behind a fancy corporate title. Over the past 2 years, he had aggressively invested in highly volatile cryptocurrency markets. He bought in right at the absolute peak using heavily leveraged margin accounts. When the crypto market inevitably crashed, his portfolio was completely obliterated overnight. But he did not stop there. He doubled down, taking out massive high-interest personal loans to cover his margin calls, desperately hoping the digital market would bounce back. It never did. I tracked a long, miserable trail of civil judgments and pending lawsuits from very aggressive creditors. He owed over $150,000. He was drowning in toxic debt, and the financial sharks were finally circling his sinking boat. I continued digging, pulling up recent credit inquiries associated with his various fake business entities. That is exactly when I found the smoking gun. Just last week, a major national bank had initiated a preliminary title inquiry on the house of my grandmother. The puzzle pieces violently snapped together in my mind, creating a horrifying picture. Trevor was not taking the house to build a beautiful nest for Jasmine and their future children. He was taking the house to use it as immediate collateral for a massive debt consolidation loan. He was going to drain every single ounce of equity out of that old Victorian home to pay off his disastrous crypto debts and keep up his pathetic charade of wealth. He planned to borrow $300,000 against the property, and because he had absolutely no actual steady income, he would inevitably default on that new mortgage within a year. The bank would swoop in and foreclose on the house, leaving my parents and my sister completely homeless and entirely destitute. A cold, heavy wave of pure disgust washed over me. My parents had stood on that porch and called me a monster. They said I was greedy and toxic and trying to steal their generational wealth. They threw my innocent, hungry children out into the freezing cold because they thought I was the enemy of the family. Meanwhile, they had gladly handed the keys to their entire future to a white con artist who was actively preparing to burn their legacy to the ground just to save his own skin. He did not care about the deep history of that house. He did not care about the decades my grandmother spent scrubbing floors on her hands and knees just to pay off the original mortgage. To him, our sacred family history was nothing more than an uncashed check waiting to be completely exploited. I leaned back in my chair and took a deep breath. The sheer level of his manipulation was staggering, but his execution was incredibly sloppy. By rushing my parents into signing a quitclaim deed to avoid paying me back, he had completely sealed his own fate. A quitclaim deed offers absolutely no warranties against existing liens. The bank was currently processing his massive loan application. Within a few days, their underwriters would discover the active tax lien owned by my limited liability company. They would immediately freeze the entire loan process because the house was legally encumbered by a massive government debt that I completely controlled. Trevor was going to hit a financial brick wall at 100 miles an hour, and he had absolutely no idea it was coming. I saved all the digital documents to a secure encrypted folder on my hard drive. I had the fraudulent deed, the pending lawsuits, the massive crypto debts, and the loan inquiry all neatly documented and filed away. I was no longer just an angry daughter seeking petty revenge for a ruined Thanksgiving dinner. I was a highly trained financial investigator, preparing to completely dismantle a criminal fraud scheme. Trevor thought he could treat me like a naive, uneducated woman. He thought he could use his skin privilege and his startup buzzwords to blind my family and rob them blind. He was about to learn a very painful lesson about what happens when you try to con a senior auditor. I closed the laptop and walked into my bedroom feeling a deep and powerful sense of calm resolve. The disgusting truth was finally out in the open, and I knew exactly how I was going to use it to completely break him. I lay down on my bed, staring up at the dark ceiling. I thought about my grandmother and the sacrifices she made. I knew she would be proud of me for protecting her hard work from a parasite like Trevor. Tomorrow was Monday, and I had to go to my corporate office. I knew the fallout from my text message was going to manifest very soon. Trevor was a coward, and cowards always send other people to do their dirty work. I drifted off to sleep with a cold smile on my face, fully prepared for whatever they decided to throw at me next. Monday morning arrived with a crisp winter chill that cut right through my tailored wool coat as I walked into my corporate accounting firm. I sat down at my massive glass desk on the 20th floor, looking out over the busy Atlanta skyline. The sleek, quiet environment of my office was my absolute sanctuary. It was a perfectly structured place where logic and numbers completely ruled over the chaotic, emotional manipulation of my family. I had barely opened the quarterly audit files for my largest client when the heavy glass door of my office suddenly swung open violently, hitting the rubber doorstop with a loud, terrifying thud. I did not even have time to look up from my digital spreadsheets before the aggressive shouting began. It was my father, Elias. His face was twisted into a dark, furious scowl, and his heavy boots left wet, dirty marks on the pristine corporate carpet. Right behind him was my mother, Brenda, looking incredibly frantic and clutching her expensive new handbag like a weapon. My young administrative assistant stood nervously in the hallway, apologizing frantically and explaining that they had pushed right past the main security desk in the lobby. I gave my assistant a calm, reassuring nod, letting her know I had the situation completely under control, and gently motioned for her to close the door and give us total privacy. As soon as the glass door clicked shut, Elias slammed his large calloused hands down flat on my desk. The sudden sharp noise echoed loudly in the quiet room, causing my pens to rattle. "What is absolutely wrong with you, Vanessa?" he demanded, his voice booming so loudly I was completely sure the junior accountants in the next row of cubicles could hear every single word. "Why did you send a corporate real estate appraiser to our house this morning?" The man was walking around the front yard taking pictures of the property and asking Jasmine incredibly invasive questions about the foundation and the age of the roof. "You are absolutely out of your mind if you think you can just hire some corporate suit to value our family home behind our backs just to intimidate your own sister." I sat back slowly in my ergonomic chair, keeping my posture completely relaxed and my face entirely blank. I had not hired any appraiser. The puzzle pieces instantly clicked together in my analytical mind. The national bank that Trevor had applied to for his massive fraudulent consolidation loan had obviously sent an appraiser out to the property as part of their standard underwriting process. Trevor must have panicked completely when the bank official showed up unannounced at the front door. To keep his massive crypto debt a complete secret from my gullible parents, Trevor immediately blamed the unexpected visitor on me. He used my established role as the family villain to create the perfect distraction, and my parents drove straight to my corporate office, ready to burn me at the stake without a single second of hesitation. "I am waiting for an explanation," Elias snarled, leaning his massive frame over the desk until his angry face was only inches from mine. "You just could not let it go, could you? You could not just let your younger sister have one single beautiful thing in her life without trying to sabotage it. You have been doing this exact same thing since you were 10 years old. Every single time Jasmine gets a little bit of happiness or stability, you have to step in and try to crush it with your cold, calculating jealousy." Brenda stepped forward, her eyes narrowed with pure resentment and bitter anger. "We know you are still angry about being asked to leave on Thanksgiving, Vanessa," she spat, crossing her arms defensively across her chest. "But sending a professional investigator to snoop around the property just to scare your pregnant sister is a new absolute low, even for you. Jasmine called me crying hysterically this morning. Her nerves are completely shot and she is terrified you are going to sue her. You know she is incredibly fragile, Vanessa. She does not have the thick skin that you do. You have always been stubborn and hard and completely unfeeling. You do not need our help because you never needed anyone but yourself. You sit up here in your fancy glass tower making your big corporate salary while Jasmine struggles every single day to just keep her head above water." Elias pointed a thick, trembling finger right at my face, his voice dripping with absolute disgust. "Your sister needs that house, Vanessa. She desperately needs the financial stability that Trevor is actively trying to provide for her. Trevor is a real visionary businessman trying to build a massive generational legacy for this family, and all you do is throw completely unnecessary obstacles in his way. You have always been independent to an absolute fault. When you were 18 years old, you packed your bags and left for college without shedding a single tear or asking for a dime. You survived completely on your own because you are tough and emotionless like a machine. But Jasmine is delicate. She needs constant protection. She needs the financial safety net that you are constantly trying to rip away from her just to stroke your own massive ego. You have to sacrifice this childish grudge and accept the fact that we are giving the house to the child who actually needs it to survive." I looked at the two of them standing in my professional space, spewing decades of toxic favoritism and completely fabricated blame. They were literally screaming at me for being strong. They were punishing me for surviving the emotional neglect they had subjected me to my entire life. They were aggressively demanding that I sacrifice my own hard-earned savings to coddle a 32-year-old woman and her deeply fraudulent husband. I did not raise my voice in response. I did not cry or show a single ounce of weakness. I simply folded my hands neatly on top of my desk and looked directly into the furious eyes of my father. "I did not send an appraiser to the house today, Dad," I said, my voice incredibly calm and completely steady. "But if a professional appraiser is walking around taking pictures of the property, I highly suggest you go home and ask your brilliant son-in-law exactly which commercial bank he is secretly trying to mortgage the house to." Elias blinked heavily, his angry face faltering for just a tiny fraction of a second. Brenda scoffed loudly, waving her hand in the air to dismiss my words entirely. "Do not try to turn this around on Trevor," she snapped, her voice shrill and highly defensive. "Trevor explicitly warned us you would say something exactly like this. He told us you would try to make up vicious lies about his personal finances just to cause a terrible wedge in our family. He is using his own private startup capital to renovate the old house, and you are just trying to steal it out from under him. You are officially ordered to cancel whatever fake corporate investigation you are running right now, Vanessa. We are the legal owners, and you have absolutely no right to interfere with our property." I slowly stood up from my chair, smoothing the minor wrinkles from my tailored suit jacket. I walked around the massive glass desk and opened my office door, motioning clearly toward the busy corporate hallway. "You have exactly 30 seconds to leave my professional workplace before I call building security to physically escort you out of this building," I said, my tone dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. "I am not investigating Trevor, and I am certainly not trying to steal anything from you. But since you brought it up, I strongly suggest you tell Trevor to completely double-check his legal paperwork. Because the brutal truth is coming for him very soon, and when it finally hits, neither of you will be able to protect your fragile little golden child from the devastating consequences." Elias glared at me with absolute sheer hatred, but he grabbed the arm of my mother and dragged her out of my office, muttering terrible curses under his breath. I watched them walk away and then closed the door quietly behind them. The confrontation was finally over, and the pieces were all perfectly in place. It was time to go see my real estate lawyer. I took the private elevator down to the underground parking garage of my corporate building. The heavy silence of my vehicle was a welcome relief after the chaotic shouting match my parents had just brought to my office. I pulled out into the busy downtown traffic, heading straight for the law firm of David Caldwell. David was a highly respected real estate attorney who specialized in complex property disputes and title litigation. I had been a client of his for several years, using his services to legally structure my various personal investments and limited liability companies. He was a man who appreciated cold, hard facts and meticulous documentation, which was exactly why we worked so well together. I walked into his quiet, upscale office suite, and his assistant ushered me straight into his private conference room. David was already sitting at the long mahogany table reviewing a stack of legal pads. He looked up and offered a warm, professional smile as I took the leather chair across from him. I did not waste any time with small talk. I opened my heavy leather briefcase and pulled out the thick manila folder I had compiled the night before. I laid the documents out on the polished wooden table one by one, perfectly aligning the edges. First, I placed the printed copy of the ridiculous quitclaim deed my parents had secretly signed over to Trevor and Jasmine. Next, I laid out the dense financial records detailing the massive cryptocurrency debts and the pending civil judgments hanging heavily over the head of Trevor. Finally, I placed the absolute crown jewel of my collection right in the center of the table. It was the official tax lien certificate from the county tax commissioner, bearing the official government seal and clearly listing my private holding company as the sole legal purchaser of the debt. David adjusted his reading glasses and picked up the documents. The room was completely silent for several long minutes, save for the crisp sound of paper turning. I sat patiently watching his eyes scan the financial disaster I had laid out before him. A slow, knowing smile began to form on his face. He set the papers down and leaned back in his chair, lacing his fingers together. "Vanessa, you always bring me the most incredibly fascinating cases," he said, his voice laced with genuine professional admiration. "Tell me you did not explicitly warn your brother-in-law about this tax lien before he manipulated your parents into signing this deed." I kept my expression entirely neutral, but a deep sense of satisfaction settled into my chest. "I told them the house had a major financial issue," I replied calmly. "I even stepped in and paid $33,000 of my own money to stop the county from throwing them out on the street right before the holidays. But my parents chose to believe Trevor when he told them I was just a greedy, manipulative daughter trying to steal their generational wealth. They signed the house over to him entirely behind my back to protect it from me." David let out a dry, heavy laugh and tapped his pen against the quitclaim deed. "Well, they certainly managed to do the exact opposite," he explained, pointing to the clumsy signatures of my parents. "This piece of paper is completely worthless as a tool for securing a new commercial mortgage. When your parents signed this quitclaim deed, they did not magically erase the history of the property. A quitclaim simply transfers whatever interest the seller has at that exact moment. And right now, their interest is completely buried under a massive delinquent tax lien that happens to be legally owned by you." He pulled out a blank legal pad and began to map out the exact legal trap Trevor had just blindly walked into. David explained that the national bank Trevor was trying to borrow $300,000 from would strictly require a completely clean title before they ever released a single penny of funding. The bank appraiser who visited the house this morning was just the very first step. By tomorrow, the underwriting department would pull the official county records and conduct a deep title search. The very first thing they would see, shining like a massive red warning beacon, was the $33,000 tax lien held by my company. "The bank is going to instantly freeze his loan application," David stated matter-of-factly. "They will completely reject the mortgage because no sane financial institution will ever take a secondary position behind a government tax lien." Trevor thought he was acquiring a massive asset to consolidate his secret crypto debts, but all he actually acquired was a massive legal liability, and it gets much worse for him. David pointed directly at the date stamped on the tax lien certificate. "Under the state law, you have to wait exactly 1 calendar year from the date of the tax sale before you can take absolute possession of the property. You purchased this lien exactly 1 year minus 4 days ago. The mandatory redemption period officially expires this coming Friday." The realization hung heavy and perfect in the quiet air of the conference room. Trevor was rapidly running out of time, and he had absolutely no idea. In order to clear the title and save his fraudulent loan application, he would have to completely pay off the entire $33,000 debt, plus a massive 20% state-mandated penalty fee. But Trevor was completely broke. He did not have the cash to redeem the lien, and the bank would not give him the loan until the lien was already redeemed. It was a perfect, inescapable financial paradox. "So what exactly happens on Friday when the redemption period expires?" I asked, even though I already knew the beautiful answer. David smiled a sharp, predatory smile that made him worth every single penny of his expensive hourly rate. "On Friday, we formally file a petition to foreclose the right to redeem," he explained smoothly. "We petition the court to permanently terminate any and all ownership claims your parents, Jasmine and Trevor, think they have. The judge will issue a final tax deed completely in the name of your private company. At that exact moment, you become the absolute sole legal owner of the Victorian house. The quitclaim deed Trevor holds becomes nothing more than a worthless scrap of paper. You will have the full legal authority to serve them with a 30-day eviction notice and forcibly remove them from the premises with the county sheriff." I looked down at the documents on the table, feeling a profound sense of poetic justice settling deep into my bones. For my entire life, I had been the scapegoat. I had been the one expected to quietly suffer and sacrifice, while Jasmine was handed everything on a silver platter. My parents had literally thrown my children out into the freezing cold because they believed the hollow, arrogant promises of a failing tech bro over the quiet, proven loyalty of their own daughter. They had mistaken my quiet patience for weakness. "We are not going to warn them, are we?" David asked, watching my face carefully to see if I would suddenly show mercy and back down. I met his gaze with absolute cold certainty. "Absolutely not," I replied, my voice steady and completely devoid of pity. "I want you to prepare all the foreclosure documents right now. Have them ready to file the very second the courthouse opens on Friday morning. Trevor is a wildly arrogant man who believes he is always the smartest person in the room. Let him figure out the title problem on his own. Let him completely panic when the bank denies his loan, and the reality of his massive debt comes crashing down on his head. I will not sign any release forms, and I will not accept any desperate apologies." They wanted to play a very dangerous game of financial manipulation with a senior corporate auditor. Now they are going to learn exactly what happens when you lose. David nodded deeply, respecting the cold, strategic finality of my decision. He gathered the documents into a neat stack and placed them securely in his filing tray. The legal trap was now officially armed and quietly ticking down to the final inevitable explosion. I stood up and shook his hand, feeling lighter and more powerful than I had in my entire life. I walked out of the law firm and stepped back into the crisp afternoon air, completely ready for the absolute desperate chaos that Trevor was about to unleash when he finally realized he was entirely trapped. I stood leaning against the side of my reliable sport utility vehicle, waiting for the final school bell to ring. The Tuesday afternoon sun was casting long shadows across the busy parking lot of the elementary school. Dozens of other parents were standing around chatting casually and waiting for their children to emerge from the brick building. I was enjoying the quiet, normal atmosphere, a stark contrast to the toxic chaos my family was constantly trying to drag me into. I checked my watch, knowing Jordan and Malik would be running out the heavy double doors any second now. I was completely lost in a peaceful thought about what I would cook them for dinner when a loud, obnoxious engine roar completely shattered the calm afternoon air. A brand new, bright white Range Rover practically sped into the school zone, ignoring the slow speed limit completely. The massive luxury vehicle aggressively swerved into the loading zone, blocking the crosswalk and forcing several other parents to step back in surprise. The dark-tinted windows rolled down, revealing the smug faces of my sister Jasmine and her husband Trevor. Jasmine threw the heavy vehicle into park and pushed her door open. She stepped out onto the pavement looking like she had just walked out of a high-end fashion magazine. She was wearing oversized designer sunglasses, a pristine white cashmere coat, and carrying a leather handbag that cost more than my first car. She looked absolutely ridiculous standing in a normal elementary school pickup line, but she clearly wanted an audience. Trevor remained in the passenger seat, leaning the seat far back and resting his arm casually out the open window with a disgusting smirk plastered across his pale face. Jasmine did not even bother looking at the other parents who were staring at her with obvious annoyance. She locked her eyes directly on me and marched straight over her high heels, clicking loudly against the asphalt. "Hello, Vanessa," she announced, her voice deliberately projected so that everyone within a 50-foot radius could hear her clearly. "I was just in the neighborhood running some very important errands and figured I would stop by to see my poor little nephews." She stopped a few feet away from me, looking me up and down with absolute disdain. She took in my simple tailored work pants and modest blouse, comparing them to her extravagant display of fake wealth. I did not move a single inch. I just looked at her with a completely blank expression, refusing to give her the emotional reaction she was so desperately craving. "You left your cheap aluminum pan on our front porch on Thanksgiving?" She continued, her voice dripping with venom and fake pity. "Mom threw it in the trash, but I felt absolutely terrible knowing how much you probably struggled to afford that sad little turkey. We know things are very tight for you right now, especially since you are a single mother raising two growing boys all by yourself." Trevor and I were talking about it, and we decided we needed to help you out a little bit. We are doing incredibly well right now, and it just feels completely wrong to let my older sister struggle to feed her kids. Before I could even process the absolute delusion of her words, Jasmine reached into her expensive designer handbag. She pulled out a thick wad of crisp $50 bills bound together by a rubber band. She peeled 10 bills off the stack and held them out toward me. When I refused to raise my hand to take the money, she let out a loud, dramatic sigh and simply dropped the cash right onto the dirty pavement at my feet. "There is $500, Vanessa," she announced, looking around to make sure the other parents were watching her incredible act of charity. "Go buy yourself a nice meal tonight. Maybe you can finally take the boys to a real restaurant instead of feeding them greasy drive-through burgers in your car. Consider it a permanent reimbursement for your little tax payment stunt. We do not want to owe you a single penny when we officially launch our new chapter." I looked down at the green bills fluttering slightly in the cold afternoon breeze. I slowly raised my eyes back to her face. "You drove all the way across town in a leased vehicle just to litter in a school parking lot?" I asked, my voice incredibly calm and completely steady. Jasmine scoffed, crossing her arms tightly over her cashmere coat. "It is not a lease, you jealous witch," she snapped, dropping the fake sweet tone immediately. "Trevor bought it for me this morning as an early Christmas present. We are celebrating a massive milestone today. The National Bank just gave us the final preliminary approval for a $300,000 renovation loan on the house. We are officially transforming that old, dusty Victorian relic into a modern, smart home. We are hiring a demolition crew to come out this coming Saturday morning." She leaned in closer, a cruel, vindictive smile spreading across her perfectly made-up face. "You remember that massive rose garden grandmother spent 20 years planting in the backyard?" She whispered, her voice dripping with absolute malice. "The one you used to help her water every single summer when you were a kid. Trevor is bringing in a bulldozer to completely tear it all up. We are pouring a massive concrete patio and installing a heated infinity pool right over the top of those stupid flowers. The house belongs to us now, and we are going to completely erase every single depressing trace of the past. The appraiser came by yesterday and confirmed the property has incredible equity. We are going to live like absolute royalty while you sit in your tiny apartment crunching numbers for a basic salary." I felt a sharp, painful twist in my chest at the mention of the rose garden. My grandmother had loved those flowers more than anything. They were her absolute pride and joy, a beautiful living testament to her decades of hard work and quiet resilience. The thought of Trevor destroying them with a bulldozer just to build a flashy pool he could not actually afford made my blood run completely cold. But I also knew exactly what she was trying to do. She was trying to trigger me into a public screaming match. She wanted me to look like the crazy, bitter sister in front of all these parents while she played the innocent victim. I heard the loud metallic clang of the school doors opening behind me. A flood of energetic children began pouring out into the crisp afternoon air. I saw Jordan and Malik in the crowd, their heavy backpacks bouncing as they ran eagerly toward my vehicle. I took a deep breath, centering my absolute focus. I knew for a fact that the bank had not fully approved their loan. The bank had simply given them a preliminary conditional offer pending a full title search. A title search that was currently hitting a massive brick wall because of the tax lien sitting safely in my legal briefcase. Jasmine stood there waiting eagerly for me to explode. She was practically vibrating with malicious excitement. I looked at her completely empty eyes, and then I looked past her at Trevor, who was still smirking in the luxury car. They were incredibly arrogant, completely oblivious to the massive financial guillotine hanging directly over their heads. I did not bend down to pick up the $500. I simply stepped squarely on top of the money, pressing the crisp bills deep into the dirty asphalt with the heel of my shoe. I turned my attention away from her completely and opened the back doors of my vehicle to welcome my children. The trap was ready, and it was time to push Trevor right over the psychological edge. Jordan and Malik ran up to the car, their heavy backpacks thumping against their winter coats. They stopped short when they saw Jasmine standing there in her bright white cashmere coat, her face twisted in a mixture of confusion and raw anger. Aunt Jasmine, what are you doing here? Jordan asked, his small voice completely innocent and oblivious to the toxic warfare happening right above his head. Jasmine opened her mouth clearly, preparing to say something incredibly cruel to a 10-year-old boy just to get back at me. I stepped forward immediately, placing my body completely between her and my children. My maternal instincts flared up, forming an impenetrable wall of protection. I placed my hands firmly on the shoulders of my boys and guided them toward the open back doors of my vehicle. "Get in the car, babies," I said, keeping my voice light and encouraging so they would not feel any of the tension radiating off the pavement. "We are going to make homemade pizzas tonight and watch that new superhero movie you wanted to see." They cheered excitedly, completely forgetting about their aunt, and scrambled into the back seat. I closed the heavy car doors securely, sealing them safely inside my world, and locking Jasmine entirely out of it. Jasmine stood there staring at the dirty footprint I had just left directly on top of her $500. The crisp green bills were now smeared with dark parking lot mud. Her face flushed a deep, angry red, making her designer makeup look harsh and uneven. "You are absolutely insane, Vanessa," she hissed, her voice trembling with genuine rage. "You are so blinded by your own petty jealousy that you cannot even accept a simple, generous gift from your own family. You are going to end up completely alone with nothing but your boring spreadsheets and your massive ego." I did not even blink. I looked right through her as if she were completely invisible. She was nothing but a loud distraction, a pathetic pawn in a much larger game of financial chess. My real target was sitting comfortably in the heated leather seat of the luxury vehicle, completely convinced he had already won the war. I turned my back on Jasmine, leaving her standing awkwardly in the middle of the crowded school parking lot, while other parents whispered and stared. I walked slowly and deliberately toward the idling Range Rover. The engine hummed with a quiet, expensive power, a mechanical symbol of the massive debt Trevor was actively accumulating. Trevor watched me approach through the open passenger window. He had a sickeningly smug grin plastered across his face, his arm casually resting on the windowsill. He thought I was coming over to beg. He thought I was finally broken and coming to apologize for ruining their Thanksgiving and to plead for a tiny piece of the massive equity he thought he controlled. As I reached the car, I placed my hands carefully in the pockets of my tailored coat and leaned down just slightly so we were exactly at eye level. "Hello, Trevor," I said, my voice dropping to a low conversational tone that only he could hear over the sound of the idling engine. "I understand you and Jasmine are celebrating a massive financial milestone today. $300,000 is a very serious amount of money to borrow against a century-old house, especially in this current economic climate." Trevor chuckled, a deep, arrogant sound that vibrated in his chest. "It sure is, Vanessa," he replied, dripping with pure condescension. "But that is exactly what happens when you have actual vision and a solid business plan." The bank looked at my portfolio and practically threw the money at me. "Your parents finally made a smart investment by betting on a real winner instead of a bitter corporate drone. You can keep your little $33,000 tax stunt. We are operating on a completely different level now." I offered him a small, tight smile, letting him bask in his fake glory for just one more precious second. "It really is an incredible achievement, Trevor," I said, keeping my tone completely flat and analytical. "But I do have one very quick professional question for you as a senior auditor. Since you are bringing in a demolition crew this Saturday and completely tearing up the property, I assume the National Bank has already fully cleared your title insurance policy." The words hung in the crisp afternoon air like a sudden drop in barometric pressure. The arrogant smirk on the face of Trevor did not just fade. It completely froze, as if his facial muscles had suddenly paralyzed. His pale blue eyes darted to the left and then snapped back to me, a microscopic flicker of genuine confusion and rising panic flashing in his pupils. He tried to maintain his casual posture, but his fingers tightly gripped the leather steering wheel, his knuckles turning slightly white against the dark material. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice losing its smooth, confident edge and dropping into a defensive, nervous register. The loan is preliminarily approved. The residential appraisal was completely flawless. We are just waiting on the final underwriting paperwork to clear on Friday afternoon. I let out a soft, knowing sigh, shaking my head slightly, as if I felt genuinely sorry for his complete lack of basic financial literacy. Preliminary approval is just a polite banking term for an empty promise, Trevor. I explained, my voice taking on the patient tone of a teacher lecturing a very slow student. A commercial bank will never actually release $300,000 until the title insurance company guarantees that the property has an absolutely clean history. They have to make sure there are no hidden judgments, no secondary mortgages, and most importantly, no massive delinquent government tax liens attached to the deed. If they find even a single black mark on that title, the entire loan is instantly frozen and denied. And since you are already leasing expensive luxury vehicles and hiring demolition crews before the title is actually cleared, I just wanted to make sure you were completely prepared for the underwriting report on Friday. Trevor swallowed hard, his throat working nervously. He opened his mouth to fire back a sharp insult, but absolutely nothing came out. The absolute certainty in my voice had pierced straight through his armor of fake startup confidence. He knew I was an expert in this exact field. He knew I would never say something like that unless I knew a massive, catastrophic secret about the house. He slowly pulled his arm inside the vehicle, the casual, arrogant posture completely vanishing. "You are just bluffing," he whispered, his voice thin and hollow, barely audible over the engine. "You are just trying to scare us because you are completely bitter that you lost everything." I stood up straight, adjusting the collar of my wool coat against the cold wind. "I am not bluffing, Trevor," I said, stepping back from the expensive vehicle. "I am just giving you a friendly piece of professional advice. You might want to call your loan officer right now and ask them exactly what they found on the county tax registry. I promise you, it is going to be a very interesting conversation. Have a wonderful afternoon." I turned and walked away, leaving him sitting in his shiny new car, drowning in a sudden, terrifying wave of silent panic. I walked back to my own vehicle where Jasmine was still fuming on the asphalt. I did not say another word to her. I simply climbed into the driver's seat, locked the doors, and drove away with my children, leaving the two of them alone in the parking lot with the ticking time bomb I had just planted directly in their laps. I drove away from the school parking lot feeling a profound sense of absolute peace. I knew exactly what was happening in the front seat of that shiny new luxury vehicle the very second my car turned the corner. Trevor definitely pulled out his phone with shaking hands. I could perfectly picture the raw panic setting into his pale face as he furiously dialed the direct number of his loan officer at the National Bank. He would have demanded to know the exact status of his underwriting report, and the loan officer would have delivered the fatal financial blow with cold corporate efficiency. They would have told him that the title search came back with a massive red flag, a cloud on the title they call it in the real estate business. They would have explained that a $33,000 delinquent tax lien was currently sitting squarely on the property and that the debt was fully owned by an independent limited liability company. The loan officer would have clearly stated that no title insurance company on earth would ever underwrite a property with an active government lien. The $300,000 loan was officially frozen indefinitely. Trevor was trapped in a nightmare of his own making. He had to drive that leased Range Rover back to the Victorian house and pretend everything was perfectly fine. He had to sit across the dinner table from my parents and Jasmine, eating their food and listening to them talk about the new swimming pool, while his entire fake empire was actively crumbling into dust right before his eyes. He could not tell them the truth. If he admitted that the loan was denied because of my tax lien, he would also have to admit that he was entirely broke and desperately trying to use their family home to pay off his disastrous crypto debts. His massive ego simply could not handle that level of absolute humiliation. He had to maintain the arrogant facade at all costs, while secretly scrambling in the dark to fix the massive hole in his sinking ship. I knew all of this for a fact because my phone started blowing up exactly 3 hours after the parking lot encounter. The barrage of communication began with a carefully calculated voicemail left on my personal cell phone. Trevor tried to use his casual corporate voice. He said, "Hey, Vanessa, I was just looking over some of the old paperwork for the house, and it looks like there is a minor clerical error at the county office regarding that little tax payment you made last month. My lawyers say it is just a simple misunderstanding, but the bank needs to clear up the paperwork before we proceed with the renovations. I am emailing you a standard release of lien form. Just sign it and send it back so we can put all this petty family drama behind us." I sat on my couch listening to the message with a cold smile. A minor clerical error, a standard release of lien. He wanted me to just sign away my absolute legal leverage and hand him the entire property for free based on a casual voicemail. I did not respond. I did not even open the email. I just let the silence stretch out and do the heavy psychological work for me. By Wednesday morning, his fake casual tone completely evaporated. The text messages started pouring in every single hour. They rapidly evolved from polite requests to desperate, completely illogical negotiations. He texted me offering to pay me back the original $33,000 plus a generous $5,000 bonus if I would just sign the release document immediately. He promised he would wire the funds the very second his renovation loan closed. As a senior auditor, I actually laughed out loud in my quiet office. It was a complete financial paradox. He needed me to release the lien so he could get the loan, but he needed the loan so he could pay me to release the lien. It was the desperate bargaining of a man who had absolutely zero cash and zero options left. When I continued to completely ignore his texts, he tried a different angle. He started using my family as flying monkeys to pressure me without actually telling them the real reason why. I received a highly aggressive text message from my mother Brenda on Wednesday afternoon. She wrote that Trevor was incredibly stressed out because some old utility bills I supposedly left behind were causing a minor delay in their construction permits. She demanded that I stop being difficult and immediately sign whatever paperwork Trevor sent me so that Jasmine could have her dream home. Trevor was actively lying to my parents, blaming me for a fake paperwork delay to hide the fact that I was holding the literal legal key to the entire property. The panic reached its absolute peak on Wednesday night. I was sitting in my dark living room sipping a cup of hot chamomile tea when my apartment intercom buzzed loudly. I did not get up to answer it. I simply opened the security camera application on my phone and watched the live feed from the front lobby of my building. Trevor was pacing frantically back and forth across the cold concrete patio. He looked absolutely terrible. His expensive tailored coat was completely wrinkled, and his hair was an uncombed mess. He buzzed my unit 6 different times, pressing his thumb hard against the plastic button. He stared up at the 4th-floor windows, his breath pluming in the freezing night air. I just sat there in the comforting darkness, watching him slowly, completely unravel. When he finally realized I was not going to let him inside the building, he walked back to his car and left one final voicemail. This time his voice was completely broken. The arrogant white tech bro persona was entirely gone, replaced by the raw, pathetic pleading of a ruined man. He begged me to pick up the phone. He admitted that his crypto creditors were threatening to take him to civil court by the end of the week. He confessed that he was drowning in debt, and that this loan was his absolute last chance to survive. He pleaded with me to just sign the release, promising on his life that he would figure out a way to pay me back eventually. He said I was destroying his marriage and ruining his life. The sheer desperation was incredibly pathetic. He wanted me to save him from the consequences of his own terrible decisions while offering absolutely nothing in return. I listened to the entire miserable message and then I calmly pressed the delete button. Thursday was only a few hours away, and the final deadline for the tax redemption was rapidly approaching. I went to sleep that night feeling completely rested while Trevor stayed awake, drowning in the terrifying reality of his own absolute failure. Thursday night arrived with a heavy, icy rain that lashed against my apartment windows. The boys were fast asleep in their room, exhausted from a long day at school. I was sitting in my dimly lit living room reviewing my final audit reports for the week when a sudden violent pounding echoed through the quiet hallway. It was not a polite knock. It was the desperate, aggressive hammering of people who felt entirely entitled to my time and my space, regardless of the hour. I glanced at the digital clock on my wall. It was nearly midnight. The final legal deadline to redeem the tax lien was exactly 24 hours away. I picked up my phone and opened the security camera application that monitored my front door. The glowing screen revealed a chaotic and pathetic scene playing out right in my hallway. It was not just Trevor this time. The entire toxic brigade had arrived. My father Elias was standing at the front of the pack, his face dark and furious. My mother Brenda was right beside him, clutching a damp tissue and wearing a deeply exaggerated expression of sorrow. Jasmine was huddled in her expensive cashmere coat, looking incredibly small and completely stripped of her usual arrogant bravado. And standing in the back was Trevor, looking like a trapped animal. His hair was wet from the rain, and his eyes were wild with absolute panic. He had finally been forced to tell them the truth. The National Bank had officially denied the loan, and the devastating reality of the tax lien had been laid completely bare. They had come to my home in the middle of the night to launch a massive coordinated ambush. I stood up slowly and walked over to the front door. I did not unlock the deadbolt immediately. I simply pressed the intercom button, allowing my voice to project clearly into the hallway. "It is midnight," I said, my tone perfectly flat and completely devoid of emotion. "Go home before I call the police and have you all arrested for trespassing and harassment." The sound of my voice seemed to trigger an absolute explosion of chaos on the other side of the heavy wooden door. Trevor pushed his way to the front, shoving his face close to the camera lens. "Open this door right now, Vanessa," he screamed, his voice cracking with raw hysteria. "You have to sign the release form tonight." The bank said, if I can produce the cleared title by tomorrow morning, they might still process the underwriter file. "You are deliberately destroying my company and my marriage. Sign the paper." I remained entirely silent. My absolute refusal to engage caused my mother Brenda to push Trevor aside and launch into her carefully rehearsed performance. "Oh, Vanessa, please," she wailed, her voice trembling with perfectly manufactured grief. "Please open the door and talk to us like a real family. We are in so much terrible pain right now. How can you be so incredibly cruel to your own flesh and blood? Your sister has been crying all afternoon. She is terrified they are going to take the house away from us. We are your parents. We gave you life, and this is how you repay us by stabbing us in the back over a stupid clerical error." I unlocked the deadbolt and slowly pulled the door open just enough to stand firmly in the threshold. I did not invite them inside. I stood tall and completely composed, looking at the pathetic display of manipulation unfolding on my welcome mat. "A clerical error," I repeated, looking directly into the fake tear-filled eyes of my mother. "Trevor finally confessed to you that his massive crypto debts were the real reason he needed that loan, and you still have the sheer audacity to stand on my porch and call my legal tax lien a clerical error. You gave away the house of my grandmother to a broke con artist who was planning to bankrupt our family legacy in less than a year." Elias stepped forward. His chest puffed out in a pathetic attempt to physically intimidate me. "Watch your mouth when you speak to your mother," he growled, pointing a thick finger directly at my face. "You set us up. You paid those taxes in secret, just so you could hold this property hostage and blackmail us. We are the legal owners of that house, and I am telling you right now that you will sign that release of lien. If you do not sign it tonight, I will personally hire the best lawyers in the state of Georgia, and I will sue you for everything you have. I will completely disown you. You will no longer be my daughter." I looked at my father, feeling absolutely nothing. No fear and no sadness. The little girl who used to crave his approval was completely dead and gone. You cannot disown someone who already walked away. "Dad," I replied, my voice dropping to a chilling whisper. "And you cannot afford to hire a decent lawyer because you gave your only valuable asset to a man who is currently dodging aggressive debt collectors. You came here tonight to bully me into saving you from the catastrophic consequences of your own terrible decisions. You thought because I am a quiet black woman, I would eventually just cave in to keep the peace. You thought you could throw my children out into the freezing cold on Thanksgiving, and I would still bail you out because of some twisted sense of family loyalty. Jasmine pushed her way to the front, sobbing uncontrollably. Her designer makeup was running down her face in dark, messy streaks. "Vanessa, please, I am begging you," she cried, reaching out to grab my arm. I pulled back sharply, refusing to let her touch me. "Trevor promised me a beautiful life," she sobbed. "He said we were going to build a pool and have a massive garden. You have so much money, Vanessa. You do not need that house. Please just let us have it. I am your little sister." I stared down at her, feeling a profound sense of absolute disgust. "You are 32 years old, Jasmine," I said coldly. "It is time for you to finally grow up. You and your fake entrepreneur husband tried to steal the only thing my grandmother worked her entire life to build. You treated me like absolute garbage and bragged about your wealth while standing on the edge of a massive financial cliff. I am not signing the release form. I am not taking your money, and I am certainly not saving you." Trevor let out a loud, guttural scream of pure frustration and slammed his fists against the doorframe. "You are a cold, heartless monster," he yelled, spit flying from his lips. "You are doing this just to ruin me." "I am doing this to legally protect what is rightfully mine," I corrected him, stepping back into my apartment. "This is the absolute last time any of you will ever speak to me. If you come to my home or approach my children again, I will file a permanent restraining order. Have a very safe drive home in the rain." I closed the heavy wooden door right in their faces and engaged the deadbolt with a loud, decisive click. They stayed in the hallway for another 20 minutes, screaming insults and crying loudly, but I simply walked back to my living room and sat down with a warm cup of tea. The toxic cord was finally completely severed. The home invasion was an absolute failure, and they knew it. Friday morning was rapidly approaching, and the legal trap was finally ready to snap perfectly shut. As I sat in the quiet comfort of my living room, staring at the glowing screen of my phone, I watched the pathetic scene continue to unfold in the hallway outside my apartment. I had already engaged the deadbolt and completely tuned out their toxic noise, but the security camera feed showed that they were not leaving. They were pacing back and forth on the carpeted floor, turning their frustration on each other. My father Elias was pointing his finger aggressively at Trevor, clearly demanding answers about the denied bank loan and the sudden financial panic. Jasmine was leaning against the wall, crying into her hands while my mother tried to comfort her. Trevor was backed into a corner both literally and figuratively. He was losing his absolute grip on my parents, and his fake empire was crumbling under the harsh fluorescent lights of my apartment building hallway. A true narcissist cannot handle being publicly exposed as a fraud. When they are pushed to the absolute brink of total exposure, they will always double down on their own massive delusions. I watched Trevor run his hands frantically through his wet hair, his chest heaving with desperate breaths. He needed to reclaim the narrative. He needed to prove to my father that he was still the powerful, wealthy entrepreneur he claimed to be. He suddenly pushed his way past Elias and marched directly up to my front door, leaning his face so close to the camera lens that his pale features were completely distorted on my screen. He began to shout through the heavy wood, his voice echoing loudly down the empty corridor for all my neighbors to hear. "Listen to me very carefully, Vanessa," he screamed, his voice dripping with toxic arrogance and raw desperation. "You think you have won this little game because you locked us out of your cheap apartment. You think you can use a minor paperwork error to hold my family hostage, but you are absolutely nothing compared to me. Next Friday night, I am hosting a massive, lavish Christmas gala at the Victorian House. It is going to be the official launch party for my new technology company and the grand unveiling of our renovation plans. I have personally invited several prominent city council members, wealthy local business leaders, and massive private investors. The entire elite community of Atlanta is going to be standing in the grand foyer of that house, witnessing my absolute success." He paused to take a deep, ragged breath, his eyes wild and wide. "I am formally inviting you to attend, Vanessa," he shouted, his tone shifting into a dark, threatening taunt. "I want you to put on your cheap corporate suit and walk through the front doors of my house next Friday. I want you to stand in the corner and watch me secure millions of dollars in private funding. I want you to witness exactly what real generational wealth looks like when it is managed by a true visionary. Bring the signed release of lien with you and hand it to me in front of all my guests. If you publicly surrender and sign the paperwork, I will generously forgive you for this ridiculous stunt. But if you refuse to show up or refuse to sign, I will personally make sure every single powerful official in that room knows exactly how toxic and completely unhinged you are. I will destroy your professional accounting reputation in this city forever." I sat perfectly still on my couch, listening to the sheer absolute madness of his public challenge. He was planning to host a massive, expensive gala in a house he was literally hours away from losing forever. He was inviting city officials and wealthy investors to celebrate a tech company that did not actually exist. He was using the last remaining pennies of his credit to build a massive, spectacular illusion just to intimidate me into signing away my legal rights. It was the most incredibly foolish and spectacularly arrogant trap I had ever seen in my entire professional career. I set my teacup down on the coffee table and walked slowly back to the front door. I did not unlock the deadbolt. I simply leaned close to the intercom panel and pressed the microphone button one final time. My voice was incredibly calm, completely steady, and entirely devoid of fear. "I accept your invitation, Trevor," I said, my words projecting clearly through the small speaker into the hallway. "I will see you next Friday night at the Victorian House, and I absolutely promise you that I will bring the exact legal paperwork you deserve." Trevor stared at the camera lens for a long, silent moment. A twisted, smug smile slowly crept across his face. He actually believed his intimidation tactic had worked. He thought the threat of public humiliation in front of city officials had finally broken my resolve. He turned back to my father and nodded confidently, as if he had just successfully conquered a massive enemy. He gathered his crying wife and my exhausted parents and finally led them down the hallway toward the elevator. I watched the screen until the elevator doors closed behind them, leaving my floor in absolute complete silence. I walked back to my bedroom and went to sleep with a peaceful heart. When I woke up the next morning, the heavy rain had stopped and the bright winter sun was shining clearly over the city of Atlanta. It was officially Friday. The 1-year redemption period mandated by the county tax commissioner had completely expired at midnight. I picked up my phone and called my real estate attorney, David Caldwell. He answered on the very first ring. "Good morning, Vanessa." David said, his voice bright and professional. "I am standing at the filing clerk window in the county courthouse right now. The petition is officially submitted." By 2 o'clock that afternoon, a county judge reviewed the tax lien documents and signed the final legal decree. The court officially extinguished every single ownership right my parents Jasmine and Trevor ever held to the property. The judge issued a brand new master tax deed completely in the name of my private limited liability company. It was done. The legal trap had snapped entirely shut. The Victorian house that my grandmother built from absolutely nothing was now 100% legally mine. I spent the entire following week preparing for the upcoming Christmas gala. I did not feel any anxiety or fear. I felt the cold, calculating anticipation of an auditor who is about to close the most important financial file of her life. I bought a brand new tailored power suit that fit me perfectly. I polished my heavy leather briefcase until it shined. Trevor wanted a massive public spectacle in front of the city elite to stroke his fragile ego and humiliate me. I was going to give him exactly what he asked for, but the grand finale was going to completely destroy him. The following Friday evening arrived with a biting winter chill that hung heavy in the Atlanta air. I pulled my reliable sport utility vehicle onto the familiar street of my childhood, but the entire neighborhood had been completely transformed into a grotesque circus of fake wealth. Trevor had actually hired a professional valet service to park cars on the narrow residential street. A massive red carpet was rolled out across the cracked concrete sidewalk leading up to the front steps of the Victorian house. Towering rental spotlights swept across the dark sky, projecting an artificial Hollywood glow over the working-class neighborhood. I handed my keys to a confused-looking young valet and stepped onto the curb, smoothing the crisp fabric of my new tailored charcoal power suit. My heavy leather briefcase hung securely from my right hand, containing the absolute destruction of the pathetic illusion unfolding before my eyes. I walked slowly up the driveway, deliberately avoiding the tacky red carpet. My eyes were immediately drawn to the side yard, where the beloved rose garden of my grandmother had flourished for over 2 decades. My heart sank heavily into my chest. The beautiful, intricate bushes that she had tended with her own calloused hands had been violently ripped from the earth. In their place was a massive gaping pit of raw freezing mud. A heavy yellow bulldozer sat idling loudly in the dark, its massive metal treads caked with the destroyed remains of my family history. Trevor had actually paid a demolition crew on credit to tear up the sacred ground just to prove a point to his fake investors. The smell of diesel fuel and freshly torn dirt completely overpowered the scent of the expensive catered food wafting from the house. It was a brutal, physical manifestation of his complete disregard for our legacy. I took a deep breath, letting the cold air fuel my absolute resolve. The garden was temporarily destroyed, but the dirt still belonged to me, and I would personally plant every single rose back in its place when this night was over. I climbed the wooden steps to the wrap-around porch and walked through the heavy oak front doors. The interior of the house was completely unrecognizable. The warm, historical charm of the Victorian architecture had been aggressively covered up by cheap modern party rentals. Stark white leather couches were crammed into the living room, and tall glass cocktail tables were scattered across the original hardwood floors. A pretentious string quartet was tucked into the corner of the grand foyer, playing classical music that was entirely drowned out by the loud, obnoxious chatter of the crowd. The house was absolutely packed with over 100 guests. I recognized a few local city council members and several wealthy real estate developers from the affluent northern suburbs. They were all dressed in expensive tailored tuxedos and designer evening gowns, sipping champagne from rented crystal flutes. Trevor had somehow managed to gather the absolute elite of the city to witness his grand illusion. I blended quietly into the back of the room, standing near a massive floral arrangement, and simply observed the sickening social dynamics playing out across the floor. My eyes easily found my parents, Elias and Brenda. The sight of them made my stomach turn with a profound sense of absolute disgust. They were supposed to be the proud patriarch and matriarch of our family, but they were acting like desperate hired help. Elias was wearing an ill-fitting rented tuxedo, holding a tray of Orst Oevers, and practically bowing every single time a wealthy white investor spoke to him. He was laughing far too loudly at their terrible jokes, desperately trying to secure his place in their elite social circle. Brenda was right beside him, wearing a gaudy, sequined dress that looked incredibly out of place. She was constantly touching the arms of the wealthy guests, speaking in a high-pitched fake voice, and bragging endlessly about the brilliant tech genius of her son-in-law. They had completely abandoned their dignity and their pride just to grovel at the feet of a man who was actively trying to bankrupt them. On the other side of the massive living room, Jasmine was holding court, holding a glass of expensive champagne and playing the role of the affluent hostess. She was draped in a dark velvet evening gown, wearing a heavy diamond necklace that I knew for an absolute fact was rented. She was smiling brightly and telling a group of older investors about the massive infinity pool they were building in the backyard. She spoke with such absolute conviction, completely oblivious to the fact that she was currently standing in a house she did not legally own. She was entirely swallowed by the delusion that Trevor had constructed for her. She actually believed she had finally surpassed me. She believed she was the absolute winner of our lifelong sibling rivalry. And then there was Trevor. He was standing in the center of the grand staircase wearing a custom-tailored velvet suit, holding a microphone, and projecting his loud, arrogant voice across the crowded room. He was in his absolute element, completely surrounded by the corporate buzzwords and fake startup jargon that he used to mask his massive failures. He was talking to a prominent private equity manager, waving his hands enthusiastically and pointing to large presentation boards that displayed the fake architectural renderings of his non-existent tech company headquarters. He was selling them a dream built entirely on stolen equity and massive cryptocurrency debt. He looked so incredibly smug, so entirely convinced of his own superior intellect. He truly believed that by filling the house with powerful people, he had successfully backed me into an inescapable corner. He thought the sheer social pressure of the event would force me to quietly hand over the legal rights to the property, just to avoid a public scene. I stood in the shadows, gripping the handle of my leather briefcase. The air in the room was thick with the smell of expensive perfume, spilled alcohol, and desperate financial ruin. The fake facade was at its absolute peak. Every single person in that house was operating under a massive collective lie. The investors thought they were funding a visionary. The politicians thought they were supporting a local business leader. And my family thought they had finally secured their generational wealth. It was a beautiful, fragile house of cards, completely suspended in the cold winter air. I checked my watch. It was exactly 8 o'clock. It was time to step out of the shadows and let the crushing weight of the absolute truth bring the entire grotesque circus crashing down to the floor. I stepped out from behind the massive floral arrangement and began walking slowly toward the center of the room. My footsteps were deliberate and steady, echoing slightly against the hardwood floors. The crowd of wealthy investors and city officials naturally parted around me, sensing the sudden heavy shift in the atmosphere. I kept my eyes locked directly on Trevor, who was still standing on the grand staircase holding the microphone. It took him exactly 10 seconds to finally notice me. The confident, arrogant smile completely vanished from his pale face, replaced instantly by a tight flash of raw panic. He quickly signaled to the string quartet in the corner. The musicians abruptly stopped playing, creating a harsh screeching sound as the bow dragged aggressively across the cello strings. The sudden heavy silence in the massive room was entirely deafening. Every single head turned to look at me standing there in my tailored charcoal suit, holding my heavy leather briefcase. Trevor gripped the microphone so tightly his knuckles turned entirely white. He knew exactly what was inside my briefcase, but he was completely trapped in his own public illusion. He had to double down. He forced a loud, booming laugh that sounded incredibly hollow and entirely fake. "Ladies and gentlemen," Trevor announced, his voice echoing loudly through the silent house, "please direct your attention to the back of the room. This is my sister-in-law, Vanessa. I am so incredibly glad she finally decided to show up tonight." He began walking slowly down the staircase, using his free hand to make broad, dramatic gestures. "You see, every successful entrepreneur faces massive obstacles on their path to greatness." Trevor continued, his tone shifting into a patronizing fake sympathy. "For me, that obstacle has sadly been my own extended family. Vanessa is a very bitter and deeply unstable woman who has spent her entire life intensely jealous of my beautiful wife, Jasmine. She could never accept the fact that my parents-in-law chose to pass this magnificent historical property down to us instead of her." The wealthy guests began to whisper among themselves, exchanging uncomfortable glances. My mother, Brenda, and my father, Elias, quickly pushed their way through the crowd, standing directly behind Trevor like loyal guard dogs. Brenda covered her mouth with her hand, pretending to be completely horrified by my presence. Elias glared at me with absolute pure hatred. Jasmine walked up to stand right beside her husband, wrapping her arms securely around his waist and looking at me with a sickeningly smug expression. Trevor stepped off the bottom stair and walked directly toward me, stopping just a few feet away. He raised the microphone closer to his mouth, making sure every single person in the room could hear his vicious lies. "Vanessa has been harassing us for weeks," he stated, his voice dripping with venom. "She has been making up wild, completely fabricated stories about my personal finances just to sabotage my corporate launch. She even tried to hold a minor tax discrepancy over our heads like a pathetic cheap blackmailer. Trevor began to pace back and forth in front of the crowd, acting like a theatrical victim. "But I invited her here tonight to prove a massive point," he shouted, waving his free hand in the air. "I wanted her to look around this room and see that real true success cannot be destroyed by petty jealousy. I wanted her to stand here and watch me officially launch a multi-million-dollar technology empire right inside the very house she tried so desperately to steal from us." He turned to the crowd, forcing another fake smile. "Please do not let her deeply sad presence ruin our beautiful evening. We are moving forward into a massive era of wealth and innovation, and we are leaving her toxic negativity completely behind us in the dirt." The crowd remained entirely silent, unsure of how to react to such a massive display of public family drama. I did not say a single word. I did not flinch or break eye contact with him. I just stood there, completely perfectly still, letting his manic energy completely exhaust itself against my absolute calm. My silence seemed to infuriate him even more. He was desperately trying to provoke me into screaming or crying so he could prove to his investors that I was the crazy, unhinged sister he claimed me to be. "Look at her," he sneered, pointing a finger directly at my face. "She cannot even defend herself because she knows every single word I am saying is the absolute truth. She thought she could bring her little leather briefcase in here and intimidate a real businessman. Well, your little game is officially over, Vanessa." Suddenly, the heavy oak front doors swung wide open. The harsh flashing red and blue lights of a police cruiser illuminated the grand foyer, casting long, terrifying shadows across the stark, white rented furniture. Two uniformed officers from the Atlanta Police Department stepped into the house, their hands resting casually on their heavy utility belts. The crowd completely gasped in shock, stepping back to clear a wide path. Trevor lowered the microphone, a deeply sinister and entirely victorious smile spreading across his face. He had actually planned this exact moment. He had called the police in advance, setting up the absolute ultimate public humiliation to completely break my spirit and force me to surrender. "Officers!" Trevor called out, waving his hand to get their attention. "Thank you so much for arriving so quickly. The woman standing right there in the charcoal suit is Vanessa. She is entirely uninvited, and she is currently trespassing on my private property." My father Elias crossed his arms over his rented tuxedo, looking incredibly proud of his son-in-law. Brenda let out a loud, dramatic sigh of relief, loudly telling a nearby investor that they had been living in absolute fear of my erratic behavior. Jasmine simply smirked, taking a slow sip of her expensive champagne, as if watching my imminent arrest was the absolute best entertainment she had ever seen in her entire life. The two officers walked directly toward me, their heavy boots thudding against the hardwood floor. The taller officer spoke first, his voice completely flat and professional. "Ma, and we received a call from the homeowner stating that you are refusing to leave the premises and causing a massive public disturbance. We are going to have to ask you to step outside immediately. If you refuse to comply, we will have no choice but to place you under formal arrest for criminal trespassing." The sheer level of absolute audacity in the room was entirely staggering. The wealthy guests pulled out their cell phones, beginning to actively record the incredible drama unfolding before them. The suspense in the massive room was pushed to the absolute breaking point. Trevor stepped closer to me, his eyes wide with absolute manic joy. He leaned in close, so only I could hear his deeply toxic whisper. "I told you I would absolutely destroy you." "Vanessa," he hissed, his breath smelling heavily of expensive champagne and pure malice. "You are going to leave this house in handcuffs, and my investors are going to write me massive checks because they absolutely love a man who takes total control of his assets. Open that briefcase and sign the release of lien right now, or I swear on my life I will let them drag you out of here like a common street criminal. You have absolutely zero power here." I looked at the two police officers standing ready to arrest me. I looked at my parents, who were literally glowing with sick, twisted pride at the sight of my public destruction. I looked at Jasmine, who was practically vibrating with malicious joy. And finally, I looked at Trevor, the fake tech entrepreneur, who was actively building his entire empire on a massive foundation of complete lies. The trap was entirely full, and the doors were completely locked. I slowly placed my heavy leather briefcase on the nearest glass cocktail table and clicked the twin brass locks open. The loud metallic snap echoed sharply through the completely silent room, signaling the absolute end of their pathetic illusion. I reached inside the velvet-lined interior of the briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. The thick, expensive paper was stamped heavily with the red and blue seals of the Fulton County Superior Court. I did not hand them to Trevor. I turned my body completely away from him and handed the entire stack directly to the taller police officer. "Officer," I said, my voice echoing clearly across the dead silent room. "I am not trespassing. I am the sole legal owner of this property, and the man screaming at you on the staircase is currently committing a massive felony." The officer looked confused, but he took the documents from my hand. The room was so quiet you could hear the soft rustle of the thick paper as he began to read. Trevor let out a loud, scoffing noise, crossing his arms tightly over his chest. "She is completely delusional," Officer Trevor announced, attempting to maintain his arrogant facade. "My wife and I hold the official quitclaim deed signed legally by her parents just last month. We are the absolute legal owners of this estate. She is just waving around fake internet papers to cause a scene. Arrest her immediately and get her out of my house." The officer did not look up from the documents. He flipped to the second page, his eyes scanning the dense legal text and the bright red signature of the county judge. He frowned deeply and pulled a small flashlight from his utility belt, shining it directly onto the raised gold seal of the courthouse to verify its absolute authenticity. I turned to face Trevor, my expression completely cold and entirely empty of any mercy. "You really should have checked the county records, Trevor," I said, my voice carrying to every single wealthy investor in the room. "That $33,000 I paid last month was not a generous gift to my parents. It was not a charitable donation to save the family. I am a senior corporate auditor. I do not make emotional investments. I used my private limited liability company to purchase the official government tax lien on this property. My parents were so deeply delinquent on their taxes that the county was actively preparing to auction the house off to the highest bidder. I bought their debt completely legally right out from under them." The color began to drain entirely from the face of my mother, Brenda. Elias took a sudden, heavy step backward, his mouth falling open in complete shock. Jasmine dropped her glass of expensive champagne. It shattered loudly against the hardwood floor, spilling sticky liquid across her designer shoes, but nobody even moved to clean it up. "When my parents signed that ridiculous quitclaim deed over to you, they gave you absolutely nothing. Trevor," I continued, stepping closer to the staircase, "a quitclaim deed offers zero protection against existing government liens. You thought you were incredibly smart. You thought you could manipulate two foolish elderly people into giving you their generational wealth so you could use it to pay off your massive cryptocurrency debts. But all they actually gave you was a worthless piece of paper completely subordinate to my tax lien." Trevor opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked frantically at his wealthy investors, who were now staring at him with absolute deep disgust. They were rapidly realizing that the visionary tech genius they came to support was actually a completely broke con artist. I turned back to the police officer, who was now looking at me with a completely different expression. An expression of deep professional respect. "The law in this state is incredibly clear." "Officer," I said calmly, "when a private entity purchases a tax lien, there is a strict 1-year redemption period. The previous owners have exactly 1 year to pay back the debt in full, plus a 20% state penalty. If they fail to pay, the entire property is legally forfeited." I pointed directly at the heavy stack of papers in the hands of the officer. That redemption period officially expired at exactly midnight last night. At 2 o'clock this afternoon, a Superior Court judge reviewed my petition, extinguished all previous ownership rights, and issued a brand new master tax deed, completely in the name of my holding company. The deed Trevor holds is entirely void. He has absolutely zero legal rights to this house. He does not own the walls, he does not own the dirt outside, and he certainly does not own the right to throw a massive fake corporate gala in my living room. The taller officer slowly nodded, folding the papers and handing them to his partner. He looked directly at Trevor, who was now literally shaking on the stairs. "Sir," the officer said, his voice booming with deep authority, "these documents are entirely legitimate, and they were signed by a Superior Court judge just hours ago. This woman is the sole legal owner of this property. You are not the homeowner." But I did not stop there. I reached into my briefcase one final time and pulled out a single sheet of bright yellow paper. I held it up for the entire room to see. "This is a formal 30-day eviction notice." I announced, my voice cutting through the thick, heavy air like a sharp blade. "It was signed and processed by the county sheriff this afternoon. Trevor, Jasmine, Elias, and Brenda, you are all officially evicted from my property. You have exactly 30 days to remove your cheap fake furniture and get out of my house." The sheer absolute silence in the room was entirely broken by a loud, agonizing wail from my mother. Brenda collapsed onto the white leather sofa, sobbing hysterically and covering her face with her hands. Elias grabbed his chest, struggling to breathe, as the massive, devastating reality of his foolishness finally crushed the last remaining breath from his lungs. They had given away everything. They had betrayed the only daughter who ever actually cared for them, and they had handed their entire future over to a completely worthless parasite. Jasmine fell to her knees, ruining her velvet dress in the spilled champagne. She looked up at Trevor, begging him to do something, begging him to fix the massive, catastrophic nightmare. But Trevor was completely frozen. His pale blue eyes were completely vacant. His entire massive, fragile ego had just been publicly detonated in front of the most powerful people in the city. He had invited the absolute elite of Atlanta to witness his grand coronation, and instead, he had forced them to watch his total, absolute financial execution. The complete destruction of Trevor did not end with the eviction notice. The taller police officer was not just a simple patrolman responding to a noise complaint. He was a seasoned veteran of the force, and he possessed a very sharp understanding of local criminal law. He stepped completely past me and walked directly toward the bottom of the staircase where Trevor was currently hyperventilating. "Sir," the officer said, his hand resting heavily on his utility belt, "earlier this evening you explicitly stated on a recorded emergency dispatch call that you were the absolute legal owner of this property. You also just stated in front of dozens of credible witnesses that you are actively securing private investments and commercial renovation loans based on the equity of this estate." Trevor looked up, his face completely slick with cold sweat. He tried to speak, but he only managed to let out a pathetic, choking sound. The wealthy private equity manager, who had been speaking to Trevor just moments before, suddenly stepped forward from the crowd. His face was dark, with absolute pure rage. "Officer," the investor said, his voice shaking with anger, "this man just handed me a massive prospectus claiming he owned this property completely free and clear. He was actively trying to solicit a $2 million investment from my firm tonight, using this house as his primary collateral." The police officer nodded slowly, pulling a heavy pair of metal handcuffs from his belt. The loud metallic clinking sound echoed like a death knell across the quiet room. "Trevor," the officer said, his voice completely devoid of any sympathy, "attempting to secure commercial loans or private equity investments using fraudulent property documents is a massive felony in the state of Georgia. It is called mortgage fraud and wire fraud. You are completely under arrest." The absolute chaotic explosion that followed was incredibly beautiful to witness. The officer grabbed the arms of Trevor, twisting them firmly behind his back and clicking the heavy metal cuffs around his wrists. Trevor finally broke his arrogant silence, letting out a loud, piercing scream of pure, absolute terror. He begged for mercy, he cried for his lawyer, he pleaded with the investors to believe his massive lies, but nobody stepped forward to help him. The wealthy elite of the city simply pulled out their phones and recorded the pathetic fake tech genius being dragged completely out of the house in shiny silver handcuffs. Jasmine completely lost her mind. She chased after the police officers, grabbing at their uniforms and screaming that they were making a terrible mistake. My father, Elias, tried to pull her back, but he was entirely broken. He looked at me, standing calmly in the center of the room, and he finally realized the absolute catastrophic magnitude of his failure. He had traded his loyal, independent daughter for a worthless criminal who was now going to spend the next decade in a federal penitentiary. Brenda just sat on the couch crying until she completely lost her voice. The investors and the politicians did not stay to offer their condolences. They quietly filed out the front door, desperate to distance themselves from the massive criminal fraud scheme they had almost funded. Within 20 minutes, the loud, obnoxious party was entirely over. The rented spotlights outside were turned off, and the house was plunged back into a deep, comforting silence. I did not say a single word to my parents or my sister. I simply picked up my leather briefcase, turned my back on their absolute misery, and walked out the front door. I had completely severed the toxic family cord, and I felt lighter than I had in my entire life. Months later, the bitter winter finally gave way to a warm, beautiful southern spring. The cheap white rental furniture was completely gone, and the Victorian house was entirely empty of their toxic memories. Trevor was sitting in a county jail cell, awaiting his massive criminal trial, facing over 15 years in federal prison for multiple counts of aggravated financial fraud. Jasmine had completely filed for divorce and was currently living in a tiny, cramped apartment, trying to survive on a minimum-wage retail job. My parents had moved into a small, subsidized retirement community, completely cut off from the massive generational wealth they had so foolishly thrown away. They tried to call me. They tried to write long, desperate letters, begging for my absolute forgiveness, but I simply returned every single envelope completely unopened. I stood in the warm morning sun, wearing a comfortable pair of denim overalls and thick gardening gloves. Jordan and Malik were running happily across the green grass, laughing loudly as they carried small plastic buckets of rich, dark soil. We were standing exactly where the heavy yellow bulldozer had torn up the earth months ago. I knelt down in the warm dirt and carefully placed a brand new vibrant red rose bush into the ground. It was the exact same species of rose that my grandmother had planted so many decades ago. I gently patted the soil around the delicate roots, feeling a deep, profound sense of absolute lasting peace. I had paid $33,000 to save this house, but the actual cost was entirely worth it. It was the precise price of my absolute freedom. I had finally broken the massive generational curse of toxic favoritism and emotional abuse. I had protected my children from their poisonous influence and secured our legacy for the future. The painful chapters were completely closed, and the triumphant ones were just beginning to bloom. Have you ever experienced a moment when cutting a toxic person entirely out of your life felt like the absolute greatest victory of your existence? I would completely love to hear your incredible stories of survival and boundaries in the comments below. If this journey resonated with you, please hit the like button and completely subscribe to hear more authentic stories of incredible resilience and growth. And if you know someone who might need to hear this powerful message today, share this video as a massive reminder that sometimes our greatest challenges lead to our most beautiful transformations. Thank you for being part of my journey, and always remember that your incredible story is still being completely written, with every single beautiful plot twist providing a massive opportunity for a much more authentic life.